South Africa. Once it was commended across the globe as the model for a modernized post-colonial state. But in recent years, murder, robbery, and assault have become a daily threat to citizens across racial and economic lines. In 2024, 60 people were murdered across South Africa every single day, more than enough to make it one of the top 10 most murderous countries in the world per capita. Why? Well, it's the internet and is all tied up in identity, ethnicity, and according to some, that nasty little G word that we probably shouldn't mention so soon in a YouTube video. But the reality of South Africa's current situation is far more complex, far more nuanced than a single matter of identity. It's a story of rampant corruption among elites and systemic failures of government just piling up on top of each other, creating a situation where violence seems so inevitable that you could hardly engineer any greater potential for devastation. Go by the descriptions of some of the news sources out there, and you might think that modern-day South Africa is essentially Mad Max on the savannah. But although no part of the country is truly untouched by violence, location really matters in South Africa, and so does context. The vast majority of violent crime in the country takes place in dense, impoverished urban areas known as townships. These are slums that are left over from the era of apartheid, when black South Africans were forced to live there to access economic opportunities that were only available on the fringes of large cities. It's where South Africans gather today, especially in impoverished areas, that violence is highest. According to the Institute for Security Studies, South Africa's four most populous provinces, Gauteng, KwaZulu-Natal, Western Cape, and Eastern Cape, contribute 72% of murders nationwide. There are two key drivers of this violence. First, there is the presence of organized street gangs, which battle each other for supremacy over the lucrative drug and arms trade. Gang culture is a significant issue in the townships, and not only does it drive up murder rates, but also robbery, kidnapping, pretty much you name it. And then there's interpersonal violence, the sort of crimes people perpetrate onto each other to settle scores, coerce a certain thing from a certain person, or to bring some sort of personal gain. Individual crime ties in closely with gang violence, since it's often associated with the excessive use of drugs and perpetrated with illegal firearms. In the South African slums, with nowhere near enough police, this dynamic creates a self-reinforcing and dangerous cycle. Violence in these urban areas has been a consistent issue in South Africa's townships for decades, but due to an expansion in government services and the successful implementation of a Firearms Control Act, the murder rate fell 55% in the 18 years after apartheid. This decrease in violence was especially beneficial to the people living in the townships, but it's also why the subsequent 52% spike over the last 13 years is so tragic. Another trend of violence that has seen a lot of play in the news recently has taken place in a much different context, that of rural South Africa. These are the now infamous farm murders brought to international attention by Donald Trump's claim of a genocide on the predominantly white Afrikaner farmer population. Now, this is a situation where two things can be true at once. It is true that President Trump is no stranger to exaggeration or hyperbole if it has any chance of firing up his supporters. Still, at the same time, it can also be true that there is a legitimate problem with violent attacks and robberies on South Africa's farms. According to the Transvaal Agricultural Union of South Africa, there have been an average of 63 murders a year on farms over the last decade. These figures include both white and black farm owners and workers who are affected by these attacks. But due to the predominantly white population of farmers in South Africa, Afrikaners are the most likely to be affected. What really differentiates these attacks from other kinds of violent crimes in the country is how they're carried out. Oftentimes, they are home invasions that see victims tied up, tortured, and sometimes killed by small bands of robbers, maybe trying to get access to a safe or perhaps a jewelry case. The fear of these attacks has led to farmers often outfitting their homes to look more like a military base than a little house on the prairie. And the situation is certainly not helped by widespread political rhetoric against South Africa's farmers, which might make some of these criminals feel justified in their actions. The last, but certainly not least, of the concerning trends that we'll cover here has been the return of political violence on a large scale. During the 80s and 90s, political violence was prevalent in many regions of the country during the simmering civil conflict that led up to the end of apartheid. Some of the most intense violence of this era was seen in the province of KwaZulu-Natal due to conflict between competing nationalist factions and political movements. Today's wave of political violence is also heavily centered around KwaZulu-Natal, but rather than fighting over ideology or nationalism, the violence today has almost everything to do with money and political power within the country's predominant political party, the African National Congress, better known as the ANC. According to Mary de Haas of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, there were at least 90 political figures killed in the province between 2015 and 2020, which is still likely an undercount. The vast majority of the victims were in some way linked to the ANC, and the murders themselves were related to internal competition within the ANC over local political posts. Targeted killings in general have gone up 108% across South Africa since 2014. Political assassinations make up a large portion of these figures, with the rest rounded out by organized crime. Whether violence comes from organized crime, farm robberies, or political conflict, none of this is helped by South Africa's regular rolling blackouts or the lack of competence in the South African Police Service, or SAPS. South Africa is a large and incredibly diverse country, roughly the size of Western Europe. So it would stand to reason that an uptick in crime on a national scale is the result of decisions made at the highest levels of society. Unfortunately for South Africans, the 2010s saw no shortage of large-scale corruption and general skullduggery from South Africa's political and business elite, and it is no coincidence that the rise of corruption came hand in hand with the rise of violent crime. To understand how corruption and criminality in the South African government trickled down and grew into the chaos affecting millions of citizens across the country, it is absolutely essential to know about two significant phenomena: state capture and cadre deployment. State capture is a term used to describe the pillaging of South Africa's government by a corrupt group of government officials and private business interests in the 2010s. The dynamics of state capture were incredibly complex. A judicial inquiry on the subject, called the Zondo Commission, released in 2022, was over 5,000 pages long, so let us know if you'd like us to delve into that one next. Poor writer who writes that. But right now, we'll try to break it down to its essential points in order to understand how the scandal led to the general weakening of the rule of law in South Africa. Now, the story of state capture revolves around former South African President Jacob Zuma, who was in office between 2009 and 2018. Zuma's political network was at the center of scandals that saw billions siphoned out of the state. The most infamous of his associates were the Gupta brothers, a trio of business magnates who had moved to South Africa from India in 1993 and built a sprawling corporate empire from humble beginnings, selling tech products at their business, Sahara Computers. President Zuma's ties with the brothers go back well before he was elected president, and we're going to take a wild guess here and assume they strengthened when the Guptas hired his son and wife to key leadership roles in their companies. The scheme worked like this. Private entities with close ties to government officials used those ties to get lucrative government contracts from state-owned companies. Oftentimes, these contracts simultaneously fleeced the country's treasury. Take the example of the Optimum coal mine, which was run by Glencore, a European mining behemoth, also probably known in parts of Africa as the Legion of Doom. Glencore made a policy of only selling the mine's lowest quality coal to South Africa's national electricity provider, Eskom. They would sell the higher quality coal on the international market. In part because of this legitimately exploitative history, Glencore was forced to sell the mine due to massive fines imposed by the government and Eskom. The idea was to sell the mine to a local South African company, and that sounds great, doesn't it? The problem is the mine was subsequently sold to a Gupta-owned company that technically couldn't even afford the purchase. To cover the difference, Eskom made them a prepayment of about $34 million, a condition not granted to any other potential buyers. To make matters worse, the contract for coal paid to the Optimum mine by Eskom, which had been around $18 million per year under Glencore, went up to around $400 million per year under the Guptas. Instances of corruption like this at Eskom are a big reason why the country has to implement load-shedding blackouts across the country on a daily basis. The grid is overloaded as it is, and legalized thievery will probably not help raise new funds for new power plants. These blackouts are prime opportunities not only for violent criminals, but also for thieves looking to steal the copper wire that the electricity runs through. So, what was initially presented as an effort to displace the exploitative legacy of foreign or white-owned companies like Glencore ultimately led to a whole new corrupt enterprise representing a growing criminalization of the South African state. The criminal factions within that state, which in this case included the president, began to go after the parts of the state carrying out criminal investigations. There were high-level purges of officials at the South African Revenue Service, which has an investigative wing dedicated to tax fraud and financial crime. And those positions were quickly filled by Zuma loyalists. A similar purge was also carried out against key leaders in the Hawks, a national police unit similar to the FBI or Scotland Yard. And these positions were also filled by Zuma cronies. What a surprise! Now, we could go on for a while with all the examples of state criminality under Zuma. In fact, we could go on for about 5,000 pages, in fact. But what's important to understand here is that the process of state capture not only led to the theft of billions from the state, but also absolutely crippled the effectiveness of the country's law enforcement institutions. A culture of corruption in the leadership of law enforcement led to a trickle-down effect on the broader police apparatus. In 2003, for example, an internal audit found that there were nearly 1,500 active duty officers in SAPS who were convicted criminals in the police. Or consider the case of Police Lieutenant Charles Kinnear, who was gunned down outside his home in Cape Town in 2020. Kinnear had drafted an affidavit in 2019 alleging collusion between SAPS officers and known gangsters for the sale of confiscated weapons on the street. Due to threats on his life, Kinnear and his family were placed under 24-hour surveillance by the police, which was inexplicably removed just shortly before his death. It's still unclear to this day who within the police command structure ordered his security to be lifted. So-called guns for gang scandals, like the one Kinnear was investigating, have become a big issue for SAPS since they directly implicate the police in the illegal gun market. One such scheme, led by a police weapons expert, led to the sale of over 2,000 guns from the police armory to street gangs. An investigation found that the deaths of over 250 children were directly tied to these weapons. So, what has enabled this rise in corruption within South Africa's police and the government at large? For a democratic country, the government's behavior looks a lot more like a one-party state. And that might be because, in reality, it kind of is. The ANC has won every single presidential election since the transition to democracy in 1994, and it also had a legislative majority throughout that time. So this is where we come to the concept of cadre deployment. Cadre deployment is an official policy of the ANC that entails the strategic placement of party members and loyalists in government positions. Now, to be clear, this happens in pretty much every presidential system to some degree. One of the reasons the presidency is so important in the United States system, for example, is not only the executive control that comes with the office, but also the ability to bring the whole gang along with you to the bureaucracy. In the case of South Africa, the ANC's been the only party in charge of the national government since the founding of the modern state. So you can probably guess where most government employees' loyalties lie. And loyalty is the key operative term here, not necessarily competence. During the Republic's early days, President Nelson Mandela tried to strike some balance between competence and loyalty in the government bureaucracy. However, in the decades since, loyalty has become the key metric for promotion within the ANC and therefore the government. Think about those political assassinations we talked about in KwaZulu-Natal. Most of them were attributed to competition within the ANC over government posts, not between different political parties. This is because for many years, the ANC was the dominant political engine of the province and the nation. If you wanted a political post, you had to take it from another ANC member, in some cases by force. Because of cadre deployment, a system of patronage developed in the ANC and the South African government, making it all too easy for state capture to take hold of the country's constitutional bodies and weaken the rule of law nationwide. This combination of state capture and cadre deployment has directly contributed to the levels of violence across the country. Now, if you're a victim of a shooting in the Western Cape, there's a good chance that the gun was sold to the shooter via a police syndicate. Perhaps you're a farmer whose house is invaded in the middle of the night during a load-shedding blackout. Corruption scandals like the Optimum mine sale are why your community continues to be left in the dark. Maybe you're a local government official in KwaZulu-Natal, murdered by your political rival who's also a member of the ANC. You might have the corrupt incentives of the modern ANC to blame. All of this corruption simply overwhelms the capacity of the South African government to do much, if anything, about the violence and crime that are plaguing everyday people across the country. This is increasingly leading people to take matters into their own hands, sometimes in pretty concerning ways. Along with corruption and cronyism, or perhaps because of it, South Africa's law enforcement capacity is frighteningly low. For every 427 citizens, there is only one police officer. Compare this with neighboring Namibia, which has approximately 280 citizens for every one police officer. In a country so plagued with high levels of crime and violence, that's just not going to cut it. For many citizens, the only way to achieve any sense of normalcy is to turn to alternative means of policing and security. This can be private security companies, community patrols, and sometimes even straight-up vigilantism. These methods can solve some problems, but without the power and legitimacy of the law behind them, they all amount to band-aids for the bigger issues we've discussed. Take private security firms, for example. South Africa has over 580,000 active private security personnel, more than the police and the army combined. These firms ensure a certain level of safety for businesses and neighborhoods willing and, most importantly, able to pay for their services. And that's all fine and good for someone living in a wealthy neighborhood in Cape Town or Johannesburg, but the people most at risk from violent crime live in the poorest communities. For those living in townships that can't afford to pool money with their neighbors for private security and get little to no coverage from SAPs, it really comes down to them. Ultimately, many people in these areas volunteer to go out on patrol with their neighbors and try to deter crime themselves, maybe getting a police officer to the crime scene if they're lucky. A similar dynamic plays out in the predominantly white farming communities, but with much more resources. Local farmers' unions will organize patrols of people on ATVs and in jeeps to scout the perimeters of people's farms. They've got the whole command HQ with radios, the whole shebang. They're also heavily armed, which is understandable to a degree considering the violence of the farm attacks. But let's say you're out and about patrolling in an abandoned building, of which there are many in rural areas, and you shoot someone in surprise who might just be doing drugs or squatting rather than invading homes. Is that justice? Well, the people in the townships face this conundrum as well, because sometimes they'll hear rumors that a heinous crime has been committed, and if the police don't show up, then they may just decide to go and carry out their own justice. Because all they know is that someone hurt their neighbor and the government isn't doing. This culture of taking the law into one's own hands has expanded into South Africa's political culture as well, most concerningly regarding migration politics. Like many countries these days, South Africa hosts a considerable number of migrants from all over Africa who are fleeing war and poverty in their home nations. It was their misfortune to arrive when violence and corruption began to envelop the country. Of course, some migrants commit crimes because, well, some people just commit crimes. That's just the world we live in. But migrants in South Africa have been the targets of sometimes deadly attacks on their homes and businesses because they are made the scapegoats for the broader political issues that we've discussed, which affect the whole country, them included. However, if you ask the people in anti-migrant political groups such as Operation Dudula, they'll probably tell you that they're carrying out justice because the government has failed them in some profound way. And ultimately, that's the theme that runs through all of these stories. All of these people, no matter how they choose to address it, are responding to the collapse of the rule of law in their home. Whether it's shopkeepers needing to hire security for their store, township residents fighting crime in their streets, or farmers patrolling their towns for home invaders, all of these are stories of people just trying to make it in a world where their government has failed them. Now, when it comes to issues like violence in South Africa, it's easy to fall into that ever-welcoming pit of nihilistic despair. In fact, after all this, I can't really blame you. But people in South Africa have to find a way to live through all of this, and to their credit, most people are doing the best they can. Most of them still care about their country and the direction it's going, and people don't want to give up on the democracy that they fought so hard for during apartheid. For what it's worth, 2024 was the first year that murder rates plateaued since 2011, and the statistics for the first half of 2025 are not showing an increase in murders either. Now, that still means levels of violence are very high, but it's not the only positive development in recent years. Even though he got away with quite a few crimes during his term, President Zuma was forced to resign under pressure from his own party in 2018, ultimately serving 15 months in prison for refusing to testify on his actions. And the Gupta brothers had to hightail it to Dubai with all of their money in order to escape prosecution. In 2024, general elections also saw the ANC lose its legislative majority for the first time since 1994. While this did come at the benefit of some hardliner parties such as the EFF or Jacob Zuma's new MK party, it also forced the ANC to bring moderate parties into a new government of national unity such as the Democratic Alliance or DA party. Nothing can be fixed overnight. But maybe bringing new ideas and new people into the fold can finally grease the wheels of South Africa's government and get the machine rolling again. At the end of the day, isn't that what democracy is all about? It's sad to see the current state of South Africa, and to see people both inside and outside of the country start to doubt the promise of their democratic institutions and the rule of law. Criminality breeds criminality, and when it's perpetrated at the highest levels of government and law enforcement, it can create a culture of chaos where violence is the answer to an increasing number of burning questions. The job of South Africa's government of national unity is to convince the people that democracy and civility are the real answers to these questions. And the only way for them to accomplish that is to show that democracy is capable of delivering results. That means less violence, less corruption, and a return to the rule of law. For the sake of South Africans, and for democracy on the whole, we hope they can make it work, and that the Rainbow Nation can inspire us all once again. Thank you for watching.